Who hurt you? The Alpha King's voice thundered across the royal hall with such force that every whispered conversation died in an instant. Even the crystal chandeliers seemed to tremble beneath the weight of his fury as a young woman in a faded gray servant's dress collapsed into his waiting arms, her body too exhausted to remain standing another second. For one endless heartbeat, no one moved. Hundreds of noble wolves, proud alphas, elegant betas, honored elders, and wealthy families simply stared as King Adrian Ashford, the most feared ruler in the Northern Territories, knelt on the polished marble floor without caring that his royal cloak pulled around him. His silver eyes swept over the unconscious Omega he held so carefully, as though she were the most precious soul in the kingdom instead of another forgotten servant no one had noticed moments before. A faint bruise darkened the edge of her wrist where her sleeve had slipped back. Another marked the delicate curve above her collar, barely hidden beneath worn fabric. His jaw tightened. The air itself seemed to grow heavier as every dominant wolf instinctively lowered their gaze beneath the overwhelming pressure radiating from their king. Clara Whitmore never imagined anyone would catch her before she hit the floor. She hadn't planned to be seen at all. For years, she had perfected the art of becoming invisible, moving quietly through crowded rooms with lowered eyes, carrying trays, pouring drinks, cleaning forgotten corners, disappearing before anyone remembered her name. Tonight was supposed to be no different. The Moon Ascension banquet welcomed every influential family across the kingdom, each hoping to earn the Alpha King's attention. Glittering gowns shimmered beneath golden candlelight. Diamonds reflected across towering windows. Musicians filled the grand hall with elegant melodies while laughter echoed beneath painted ceilings that celebrated generations of victorious rulers. Yet none of those beautiful things belonged to Clara. She existed only in the spaces between them, another silent servant instructed to remain unseen. She had repeated those words to herself since sunrise. Stay quiet. Don't make mistakes. Don't look at the king. Just survive until morning. It should have been simple. Instead, every passing hour stole another piece of her strength. The heavy serving trays grew impossible to lift. The endless smiles she offered guests became harder to hold. Her breathing turned shallow, each step lighter than the last, as though the polished marble stretched endlessly beneath her worn shoes. Still, she refused to stop. She always refused, because stopping invited questions, and questions led people back to the place she feared more than anything, home. Then, just before midnight, fate quietly changed its course. As Clara crossed the center of the ballroom carrying a silver pitcher filled with sparkling cider, the room suddenly tilted beneath her feet. Candlelight blurred into streaks of gold. Music drifted farther away. The last thing she remembered before darkness swallowed everything was a pair of piercing silver eyes looking directly at her, not through her, not beyond her, but at her, as if for the very first time in her life. Someone truly saw the broken Omega who had spent years pretending she was impossible to notice. 3 hours earlier, the palace had looked nothing like the place where silence would soon replace laughter. Warm candlelight spilled across polished marble, musicians tuned their instruments beneath towering arches, and servants hurried through endless corridors carrying silver trays, fresh flowers, and crystal glasses, while the greatest families in the Northern Territories arrived one elegant carriage after another. Clara Whitmore entered through the servants' gate long before sunset, keeping her head lowered as she adjusted the plain gray apron that marked her place among the palace staff. No one greeted her. No one asked her name. That was exactly how she preferred it. Invisible people survived longer. She quietly accepted a tray from the head steward, offered a respectful nod, and blended into the rhythm of dozens of workers preparing for the kingdom's most important celebration. Around her, excited conversations floated through the hallways. Every noble family believed tonight could change their future. Rumors claimed the Alpha King had finally agreed to attend the banquet from beginning to end after avoiding public celebrations for nearly a year. Some whispered he intended to announce a royal alliance. Others believed he was searching for the woman destined to become his Luna. Clara ignored every rumor. Fairy tales belonged to powerful people. Her world had always been measured by simple goals. Finish every task. Avoid drawing attention. Return home before sunrise. She carried polished glasses from one ballroom to another, replaced candles before they burned too low, and straightened embroidered table runners with careful hands that never stopped moving. Every motion was practiced, graceful, almost invisible. More than once, passing nobles reached for drinks she offered without ever looking at the face of the servant holding the tray. She did not mind. Being unseen was safer than being remembered. Still, something about the palace felt different tonight. The air carried an energy that raised the tiny hairs along her arms. Even the palace guards stood straighter than usual, their eyes constantly shifting toward the grand entrance. The servants noticed it too. They spoke in quiet voices whenever the steward walked away. Some wondered whether the king would smile for the first time in months. Others insisted he never smiled at all. Clara listened without joining the conversation. She had learned long ago that silence protected fragile hearts. As evening settled outside, golden light faded beyond stained glass windows, replaced by the cool silver glow of the rising moon. Guests filled the ballroom until music echoed from every corner of the palace. Clara slipped between crowded tables with remarkable care, making certain every glass remained full while avoiding the center of attention. Once, she paused beside a window for only a second, taking one slow breath before returning to work. The reflection staring back at her looked pale and tired, but she forced a gentle smile anyway. No one needed to carry the weight she hid behind that expression. Somewhere beyond the massive carved doors, a royal horn suddenly sounded across the palace grounds. Every conversation stopped. Every servant froze. Every noble turned toward the entrance. The Alpha King had arrived, and without realizing why, Clara felt her heartbeat change as though destiny itself had quietly stepped into the room. The great doors opened without a sound, yet every heart inside the ballroom seemed to pause at the same moment. King Adrian Ashford stepped into the hall with calm confidence instead of dramatic ceremony, wearing a midnight black formal coat embroidered with silver thread that reflected the moonlight pouring through the towering windows. He acknowledged the respectful bows with a slight nod, but his expression remained unreadable. The musicians resumed their elegant melody. Conversations slowly returned, and the celebration continued as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet everyone watched him from the corner of their eyes, hoping to earn even a brief glance from the ruler whose decisions shaped the future of every family in the kingdom. Clara kept her attention on the tray balanced carefully in her hands. She reminded herself that she was only another servant among dozens moving through the crowd. She refilled crystal glasses with sparkling cider, offered warm bread to elderly guests, and quietly removed empty plates before anyone needed to ask. More than once, people reached toward her without ever meeting her eyes. She accepted every silent request with the same gentle smile she offered everyone, because kindness had become the one thing no one could take away from her. As she crossed the ballroom, she noticed a young boy standing alone beside one of the marble columns, clearly overwhelmed by the crowd surrounding him. His parents were engaged in conversation several yards away, unaware that he looked ready to cry. Clara set her tray on a nearby table for only a moment, knelt to his height, and handed him a small pastry shaped like a crescent moon. The child's worried face brightened immediately. He whispered a quiet thank you before running back toward his family, never realizing how much that simple smile meant to the woman who had given it. Clara picked up her tray again and continued working as though nothing had happened. A few minutes later, she noticed an elderly guest searching the room with uncertain eyes while leaning heavily on an elegant walking cane. Without drawing attention, Clara gently guided him toward his assigned seat before returning to her duties. The older gentleman offered a grateful nod, but the surrounding nobles barely noticed either of them. They were too busy discussing wealth, influence, and royal alliances to pay attention to acts of quiet compassion. Across the ballroom, Adrian accepted greetings from governors, generals, and respected elders, yet his focus drifted unexpectedly. His sharp eyes caught brief glimpses of the gray-dressed servant moving gracefully through the sea of expensive gowns and tailored suits. She never lingered. She never sought recognition. Somehow she always appeared where someone needed help before disappearing again into the crowd. He watched her comfort the frightened child. He saw her assist the elderly guest. He noticed that despite carrying one of the heaviest trays in the hall, she still stepped aside so another servant could pass first. None of those actions were grand enough for applause, but together they painted a picture he could not ignore. There was a quiet strength about her that stood apart from the polished performances surrounding him. Adrian did not know her name. He did not know why his instincts refused to look away. He only knew that among hundreds of beautifully dressed guests competing for his attention, the only person who seemed completely uninterested in being noticed had somehow become impossible for him to overlook. The evening unfolded with effortless elegance for everyone except Clara. Each passing minute made the ballroom feel larger, brighter, and somehow farther away, as though she were walking through a beautiful dream that was slowly drifting beyond her reach. She kept moving because stopping was never an option. One tray became another. One table led to the next. She thanked guests who barely acknowledged her presence and smiled whenever someone asked for another glass of sparkling cider or another basket of warm bread. No one realized how carefully she measured every breath. No one noticed the slight tremble beginning to creep into her hands. Hours earlier, she had quietly skipped the servants' dinner after giving her meal to a young kitchen helper who had looked exhausted after working since dawn. It had seemed like such a small sacrifice at the time. Now her empty stomach and weary body were beginning to collect the cost. Even so, she refused to complain. She had endured difficult days before. She simply needed to finish one more hour. Just one more hour. As she crossed the ballroom again, the laughter surrounding her became strangely distant. The orchestra sounded softer, as though the musicians had stepped behind a closed door. The glittering chandeliers blurred into circles of golden light that shimmered above her head. Clara paused beside a marble pillar, pretending to adjust the silver pitcher resting on her tray while she quietly steadied her breathing. She closed her eyes for only a second, hoping the dizziness would pass unnoticed. When she opened them again, the celebration continued exactly as before. Noble families exchanged polite smiles. Crystal glasses touched with cheerful laughter. Somewhere near the center of the ballroom, governors and council members surrounded King Adrian in conversation about trade routes and harvests. None of them noticed the servant gathering enough strength to take another step. Clara drew a slow breath and continued forward. She reminded herself that she had promised never to become a burden to anyone. If she could simply deliver the final tray, she could slip into the servants' corridor for a moment of rest before returning to work. That thought carried her several more yards across the polished marble floor. Then an unexpected warmth spread through the room. At first she thought it came from the hundreds of candles surrounding the ballroom, but the feeling was different. Gentle, steady, almost comforting. Without meaning to, she lifted her eyes. Across the sea of elegantly dressed guests, King Adrian happened to look in her direction. Their eyes met for the briefest moment. Clara immediately lowered her gaze, embarrassed that she had forgotten her place even for a heartbeat. Yet something inside her shifted. For reasons she could not explain, she no longer felt completely invisible. Adrian noticed the change instantly. The graceful servant who had moved through the evening with quiet confidence suddenly looked unsteady. Her shoulders had grown tense. The silver pitcher she carried dipped slightly before she corrected it with visible effort. His conversation continued around him, but the words faded into meaningless background noise. Every instinct he possessed urged him to pay attention. Clara took another careful step, then another. The edges of the ballroom dissolved into pale light. The music disappeared entirely. Her fingers slowly loosened around the polished handle of the pitcher as strength slipped away faster than she could fight it. The silver container tilted, catching the candlelight for one brilliant instant before beginning to fall. At the exact same moment, Adrian moved. Before the silver pitcher could strike the marble floor, a strong hand caught it without looking, while another reached Clara an instant later, steady enough to keep her from collapsing onto the cold stone beneath her feet. A quiet gasp swept through the ballroom as King Adrian lowered himself without hesitation, supporting the exhausted servant with the same care another man might reserve for a priceless treasure. The music faded into uneasy silence. Conversation stopped in the middle of unfinished sentences. No one could remember the last time the Alpha King had interrupted a royal gathering for anyone, let alone a servant whose name was unknown to nearly every guest in attendance. Clara drifted somewhere between consciousness and sleep, barely aware that the warmth surrounding her no longer came from candlelight. She felt the firm rhythm of a heartbeat beneath her cheek and the reassuring strength of steady arms preventing her from falling any farther. Her breathing remained shallow, But for the first time that evening, it no longer felt like she had to fight the world alone. Adrian studied her face with growing concern. She looked younger than he had first assumed, her expression peaceful only because exhaustion had stolen the energy needed to hide it any longer. A loose strand of chestnut hair rested across her forehead. He carefully brushed it aside, noticing how unusually cool her skin felt despite the warmth filling the crowded ballroom. As he adjusted the sleeve of her worn uniform to make certain she was comfortable, faint marks near her wrist became easier to see. They were old enough to have faded, but recent enough to tell a story that no one had bothered to ask. His expression hardened, though his movements remained remarkably gentle. The royal physician hurried forward, kneeling beside them with a leather medical case already open. After only a brief examination, the elderly healer looked up with quiet concern. "Your Majesty," he said respectfully, "she appears severely exhausted. She has likely been pushing herself beyond healthy limits for quite some time. She needs rest, nourishment, and peace more than anything else." Adrian gave a single nod, but never released Clara from his arms. Around them, uncertainty spread across the gathered nobles. Some exchanged confused glances. Others whispered behind carefully raised fans, struggling to understand why the king seemed so personally affected by the condition of an ordinary servant. None of them noticed that several palace employees had quietly lowered their heads, their expressions carrying something very different from surprise. It looked almost like guilt. Adrian noticed. Years of ruling had taught him to recognize silence that carried hidden truths. His silver eyes slowly swept across the faces surrounding him. Most appeared merely curious. A few seemed uncomfortable. One steward suddenly avoided meeting his gaze altogether. That single reaction settled heavily in the king's mind. He had witnessed enough negotiations, enough court hearings, and enough difficult decisions to understand when fear entered a room for reasons no one wished to admit aloud. He looked back at Clara, whose fingers instinctively tightened around the fabric of his sleeve even while unconscious, as though some part of her had finally found a place where she felt safe enough to stop pretending she was strong. Adrian drew one slow breath before speaking with calm authority that echoed through the silent ballroom. "Prepare the royal guest chamber," he ordered. "She will recover under my protection." Not a single voice questioned the command. Yet as palace guards stepped forward and servants hurried to obey, more than one noble quietly realized that whatever had begun with the collapse of an overlooked young woman was about to change the kingdom in ways none of them could possibly foresee. The royal guest chamber overlooked the eastern gardens where moonlight painted silver patterns across quiet fountains, a world completely different from the crowded ballroom Clara had left behind without ever knowing it. The room was warm, peaceful, and filled with the faint scent of cedar and fresh lavender. A fire crackled softly inside the stone fireplace while the royal physician finished preparing a cup of herbal tea on the nearby table. Clara remained asleep beneath a light blanket, her breathing slow and steady now that the strain of the evening had finally lifted. Adrian stood near the window with his hands folded behind his back, looking out across the palace grounds without truly seeing them. His thoughts never wandered far from the young woman, resting only a few feet away. Something about her quiet resilience lingered in his mind. She had spent an entire evening helping everyone around her while asking nothing for herself. That alone would have earned his respect. Yet there was something else, something hidden beneath the careful smile she had worn throughout the banquet. The physician approached and spoke in a calm voice. "Your Majesty, she will recover with proper food, water, and uninterrupted rest. However, this level of exhaustion does not happen overnight. Someone has ignored her well-being for far too long." Adrian slowly turned. "Can you determine where she serves?" The physician nodded thoughtfully. "Her uniform belongs to the Whitmore household staff. They were among tonight's honored guests." The name settled heavily inside the room. Adrian recognized it immediately. The Whitmore family enjoyed considerable influence throughout the northern provinces and had maintained a respectable reputation for generations. Yet reputation and truth had never been the same thing. He looked once more toward Clara. Even in peaceful sleep, her hands remained gently folded together as though she still expected to be called back to work at any moment. A quiet knock interrupted the silence. The captain of the royal guard entered, offering a respectful bow before speaking. Your Majesty, several palace servants have requested permission to speak privately. They insist the matter concerns the young woman. Adrian answered without hesitation. Bring them here. Minutes later, 3 servants stepped carefully into the chamber. They appeared nervous, exchanging uncertain glances before the oldest among them finally found the courage to speak. Your Majesty, Miss Clara never complained, the elderly housekeeper said softly. She always smiled, even when others forgot she needed kindness too. She often shared her meals with younger workers. She stayed late whenever someone became ill. If another servant made a mistake, she quietly helped fix it before anyone noticed. A young kitchen assistant nodded quickly. She helped me during my first week here. I was frightened and dropped an entire basket of fresh bread. I thought I would lose my position. She cleaned everything with me and told the steward it had been an accident caused by slippery floors. She protected me even though we had only just met. Adrian listened without interrupting. Each story revealed another piece of the woman sleeping peacefully across the room. None described someone seeking attention or sympathy. Every memory reflected generosity, patience, and quiet strength. The captain of the guard finally stepped forward again. Your Majesty, there is one more detail. Several servants mentioned that members of the Whitmore household rarely allowed Miss Clara to rest during public events. No formal complaints were ever filed, but many believed she carried responsibilities far beyond those assigned to a single servant. Adrian remained silent for several moments. Then he looked toward Clara once more, his expression calm but unmistakably resolved. Whatever truth had remained hidden behind her gentle smile for so many years, he intended to uncover it, not because she had asked for help, but because no one who carried such quiet kindness should ever have been left to stand alone. Morning sunlight slowly filled the eastern wing of the palace, casting gentle beams across polished wooden floors as Clara continued to rest peacefully. Outside her room, however, the atmosphere had quietly transformed. Word of the previous night's unexpected events had spread through every corridor before dawn. Servants whispered while preparing breakfast. Royal advisors exchanged cautious glances during early meetings. Even the palace guard stood a little straighter than usual, sensing that the king had entered the day with unusual determination. Adrian had not returned to his private chambers. Instead, he spent the first hours of the morning inside the royal council room reviewing reports that had nothing to do with trade or military affairs. Every document placed before him concerned the Whitmore family. Tax records, household registrations, employment ledgers, charitable contributions, and years of public appearances painted the image of an honorable noble house. Yet something about the picture felt too carefully arranged. It lacked the imperfections that naturally appeared in every truthful story. The captain of the royal guard entered carrying several sealed statements gathered from palace employees. Your Majesty, additional servants requested permission to speak after hearing that Miss Clara remained under your protection. Adrian accepted the papers without speaking. One by one, he read their testimonies. None contained dramatic accusations. Instead, they revealed small details that quietly formed a much larger truth. Clara always arrived before everyone else. She was usually the last to leave. She frequently declined meals, claiming she was not hungry. She thanked people even when they were helping her. She apologized for inconveniences she had never caused. Several servants admitted they had offered assistance over the years, but she always smiled gently and insisted everything was fine. Reading those words unsettled Adrian more than any accusation could have. He understood that kindness sometimes became a shield carried by people who believe their own burdens should never trouble others. The physician entered moments later carrying a written report. Your Majesty, Miss Clara is beginning to wake. She remains weak, but she is recovering well. Adrian stood immediately and walked toward the guest chamber. When he quietly entered the room, Clara was sitting upright against the pillows, looking around with obvious confusion. Her eyes widened the moment she recognized the elegant surroundings. She instinctively reached for the blanket, almost as though she feared she had accidentally entered a place where she did not belong. When she noticed Adrian standing near the doorway, she tried to rise from the bed at once. Your Majesty, I am so sorry, she said softly. I did not mean to interrupt the banquet. I should return to work immediately. Adrian gently raised one hand, stopping her before she could stand. You are not returning to work today. Clara lowered her eyes. But the Whitmore family will expect me. Those simple words lingered in the quiet room. She did not say they would worry. She did not say they would miss her. She said they would expect her, as though fulfilling endless duties had become more familiar than receiving concern. Adrian noticed the difference immediately. He pulled a nearby chair closer and sat across from her, allowing his voice to soften. Miss Whitmore, no responsibility is more important than your health. You will remain here until the physician says you are fully recovered. Clara looked at him in stunned silence, unable to remember the last time anyone had spoken to her with such patient respect. Before she could answer, another palace attendant appeared at the doorway carrying an unexpected message. Representatives of the Whitmore family had arrived at the palace gates, requesting permission to take Clara home. The representatives of the Whitmore family waited beneath the palace's towering stone archway with polished smiles that looked convincing from a distance but strangely hollow up close. Lady Evelyn Whitmore stood at the front of the small delegation, dressed in an elegant navy gown with a graceful silver brooch resting at her collar. Beside her, her son Nathan maintained a respectful posture while several household attendants remained quietly behind them. Anyone seeing the family for the first time would have assumed they had come only to bring a beloved relative home. Inside the palace, Clara's expression slowly faded as soon as she heard their names. The warmth that had begun returning to her eyes disappeared beneath familiar uncertainty. She lowered her gaze to the blanket resting across her lap and gently folded her hands together, as though preparing herself to accept whatever came next. Adrian noticed the subtle change immediately. It was not fear alone. It was the quiet resignation of someone who had spent years believing she had no right to refuse another person's expectations. He spoke gently. "Do you wish to see them?" Clara remained silent for several long seconds before answering with complete honesty. "If they have come for me, they will expect me to return." Adrian listened carefully. Once again, she spoke about what others expected instead of what she wanted. The difference grew clearer with every conversation they shared. Before he could respond, the captain of the royal guard entered the chamber carrying another collection of written statements gathered throughout the morning. "Your Majesty," he said respectfully. More palace employees requested permission to speak after learning that members of the Whitmore family had arrived. Adrian accepted the reports. The first came from an elderly palace gardener who remembered Clara stopping to help carry heavy baskets despite already being late for her own duties. The second described how she quietly mended a torn servant's uniform with her own sewing kit rather than allowing a younger worker to be embarrassed before the steward. Another statement explained that whenever leftover bread remained after royal events, Clara always made certain the newest employees received food before she accepted anything for herself. Every account told the same story. She gave comfort before seeking it. She offered kindness before asking for any in return. Not one witness described a selfish moment. Adrian slowly closed the final report and looked toward Clara with renewed understanding. "You have earned the respect of everyone who truly knows you," he said quietly. Clara blinked in surprise. "I only did what anyone should do." Adrian offered the faintest smile. "That is exactly why it matters." Moments later, Lady Evelyn and Nathan were escorted into a formal reception room instead of the guest chamber. They expected Clara to be waiting for them. Instead, they found the Alpha King seated calmly at the head of the room. Lady Evelyn bowed gracefully. "Your Majesty, we appreciate your generosity in caring for our niece. We have come to take her home so she may continue recovering among her family." Adrian regarded her without anger and without haste. His voice remained perfectly composed. "Miss Whitmore will remain under royal care until her physician confirms she has fully recovered. That decision is final." For the first time since entering the palace, Lady Evelyn's practiced smile faltered ever so slightly. Nathan glanced toward his mother before lowering his eyes. Neither of them argued. They simply realized that the quiet young woman they had always assumed would return, without question, was no longer standing alone. And somewhere beyond the palace windows, as afternoon sunlight settled across the gardens, the first fragile seed of hope began to take root inside Clara's heart, even though she had not yet dared to call it by its name. 3 weeks passed before Clara stepped outside the royal guest chamber without the physician insisting that someone walk beside her. Strength slowly returned with regular meals, peaceful nights, and something she had never truly experienced before, the certainty that she would not be asked to earn every moment of kindness. Each morning, she wandered through the eastern gardens where white roses climbed stone walls and songbirds filled the air with gentle melodies. Palace staff greeted her by name now. Young servants smiled when they saw her. The kitchen assistant she had once helped proudly carried fresh pastries to her table every breakfast, insisting it was finally his turn to return her generosity. Clara accepted each gesture with quiet gratitude, though she still found herself apologizing out of habit. Every time she did, Adrian reminded her with patient warmth that she had nothing to apologize for. His words slowly became something she began to believe. During those same weeks, the Royal Council completed its review of the Whitmore household. Witnesses came forward willingly. Household records revealed years of responsibilities placed almost entirely upon Clara, while the recognition for her work was often claimed by others. The findings described neglect, unfair treatment, and repeated failures to provide the care owed to a member of their own family. The council recommended new protections for household workers across the kingdom, ensuring that every servant, regardless of status, would receive fair conditions, proper rest, and the right to report mistreatment without fear of retaliation. Adrian approved every recommendation without hesitation, declaring that dignity was never a privilege reserved for the powerful. News of the decision spread quickly, and people began speaking less about a mysterious servant who had collapsed at a banquet and more about the quiet woman whose kindness had inspired lasting change. On the evening of the Harvest Moon celebration, the palace welcomed guests once again, but this gathering felt different. There was less competition and more gratitude. Clara stood near the balcony overlooking the moonlit gardens wearing a simple ivory gown chosen by the royal seamstress, elegant without being extravagant. She looked almost surprised by her own reflection, as though she were still searching for the invisible servant she had once believed she would always remain. Adrian joined her beneath the silver light, offering a gentle smile that carried none of the distance expected from a king. For a quiet moment, neither of them spoke. They simply watched the moon rise above the palace towers. Finally, Adrian extended his hand. Clara looked at it, then at him, uncertainty lingering only for a heartbeat before she placed her hand in his. His voice remained calm, but every person standing nearby heard the quiet promise he chose to make. You spent too many years believing your kindness made you easy to overlook. It did not. It made you unforgettable. Clara felt tears gather in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the unfamiliar comfort of being seen exactly as she was. Around them, the guests lowered their heads with sincere respect, not because tradition demanded it, but because they had witnessed the strength of compassion changing a kingdom. As the palace bells echoed across the valley and the moon climbed higher into the night sky, Clara realized that destiny had never begun when she fell into the Alpha King's arms. It had begun the moment someone finally chose to see the quiet light she had carried within her all along, and from that night forward, she never again questioned whether she deserved to stand in the light beside those who truly valued her heart.